that front page from the senior terrorist policeman saying that that social media use by teenagers is like smoking 40 years ago. I mean, it's a very graphic way to put something, but I think actually strikes a chord with lots of people. I think he's absolutely on the money with this, and I think I've thought about that analogy a lot. About how, in the beginning, you know, tobacco firms were saying smoking's really good for you, everybody should sort of do it, and now it's sort of seen, you know, we look back on, and I think that's exactly where we are with social media. I think that so many of the, and I don't want to sound all Mary Whitehouse, but so many of the ills that we are looking at across society, particularly with young people, and we know, for example, in some of the absolutely brutal attacks that we sadly have to discuss quite regularly on this programme, exposure to incredibly violent, misogynistic, pornographic, extremist material, I think if you have a fragile young mind and absolutely kind of almost minute-by-minute consumption of this, where the algorithm will feed you harder and harder stuff, if you've got a young, fragile mind, how can that be good for your development? How can that be good for your psychology? How does that not kind of rot your brain from within at a young age? So I think this person is absolutely spot on, and I think our tech companies have got to do way, way more on this.
So this is Matt Jukes, who's Assistant Commissioner at Scotland Yard and leads National Counter-Terrorism Policing. As you say, calling for greater regulation of social media companies. I think there's going to be the online safety bill coming out in just a few weeks or months. It enacts. It actually starts. Yes. It actually starts to be effective in the next few weeks. Yeah. Well, and I mean, not before time, because of course we know, in particular, the Southport killer was radicalised to a certain degree by what he was watching. Yeah. In the minutes up to his attack. There's a whole catalogue of ills, from eating disorders that are fuelled by this, mental health problems, and then at the hard end, the sort of encouragement and the facilitation, if you like, of terrorism. The only consideration for me that holds me back is, where do you then start regulating without infringing on free speech? Because it is a platform, and we don't go out to Hyde Park Corner a couple of miles from here and say you can stand there and you can say whatever you want as long as it doesn't offend anyone who sort of... And that's the problem when you bring in regulation. If it stopped the terror stuff, if it stopped the sort of horrible pornographic misogyny and the mental health problem-inducing stuff, great. But where do you draw legislation that does that without actually making it a bit difficult for you to say something very legitimate about how you feel about religion or politics? The Southport killer was watching, on his way to commit those murders, a video of a terrorist killings in Australia, which is banned in Australia on social media because it's so horrific, but it's accessible all across the rest of the world because Elon Musk says, no, this is about defending free speech. And free speech, which means a 17-year-old watches a terrorist killing before going to kill 3 daughters, that feels... 3 girls, that feels as though it's the wrong side of whatever line you draw. I think that's absolutely right. Look, I think it's always a difficult sort of judgment call, but I think we are off to the wacky races if we're like, on the name of free speech, you're allowed to have children accessing incredibly violent material like beheadings or people getting killed or terrorist attacks, things like that. I just think we are crazy. The other thing as well is, like, we shouldn't underestimate the kind of poisoning effect that hardcore violent pornography is having on young boys and young girls. Just last night, yesterday in the House of Lords, we were having a really, really good debate about AI and deep fake pornography being used. There's a very good young peer, Charlotte Owen, who's been doing some work on this. And, you know, this stuff, it is almost like a sort of violence against, you know, women and girls if this happens to you, or young men if it happens to them as well. We've turned into... The internet and social media has turned into a Wild West. You know, you've got young people getting bullied, self-harming. We know Molly Russell had that terrible thing. Her father has set up that institution and the foundation. Now, we have to do more on this.
we are, I think, in a ticking time bomb of young people, particularly with mental health problems, pressure, pornography, bullying, all of this kind of stuff. And we're talking about, you know, these awful stories, whether it's Southport, whether these other killings. We come on your programmes and we say, isn't this awful? Why is this happening in our society? Well, this guy is on the money.
And do you know one interesting thing? In China, you don't have access to pornography. I hadn't realised that, but I have a son studying there, and it changes society. Kids grow up, you know, more innocent somehow, less obsessed with, you know, this is not titillating stuff. This is nasty, horrible stuff that's out there, and it has a bad effect on people. And depriving them of that actually brings about a whole lot of benefits. And they look to the West and they think we've lost our way because we have a generation of kids who are all over the shop.
It's so hard for our generation, or people in their kind of 30s, 40s, as well as people like me in our 50s, because, you know, unlike crossing the road, where we learned to do that safely, we had no experience of this at all, of seeing this kind of stuff on your phone or on the internet when we were growing up. So it's almost hard to imagine what it's like for 13 and 14-year-olds, you know, together as mates looking at this stuff and what that does to you, because it's so outside our experience.
And just one other point on this. I know things have changed now. A lot of social media companies are changing how they're doing things. But beforehand, if you were a publisher, whether you were a newspaper or a media organisation like ITV, and you wanted to put something that was quite graphic, you would have people that were very trained and skilled to look at and filter out this terrible material. And often those people would be quite traumatised by what they saw and have counselling to deal with it. Now you're literally letting that stuff raw into children 10, 11, 12. And if adult fact-checkers needed psychotherapy, they needed proper checks to deal with this, why are we letting our kids get this stuff completely raw?
Guto, let's talk about the sort of shockwaves that went around the world when Donald Trump did the press conference with the Israeli leader this week and said that the United States is going to take over Gaza. And the Palestinians who live there should be resettled in Egypt and Jordan. And the Gaza Strip is going to be transformed into the Riviera of the Middle East. Has anybody backed him?
He keeps telling us that this is very popular and all that. I mean, what I find fascinating with him is if you take him literally, then he's not only vulgar and odious, but he's actually, you know, mad and dangerous. And I think that's too simplistic, because somewhere in a lot of what he says, there's a little shred of something that is worthwhile. When you look at the pictures of Gaza, you think, OK, what is the alternative? It's not that his plan is attractive, but you look at that rubble, the scale of the devastation. He didn't cause that. You know, it was Israeli bombing that reduced Gaza to rubble, and that's the true horror here. It is a beautiful part of the world. It could be a fantastic place to live, but it's not going to be while there's conflict and while there's rubble. So somewhere in the madness of what he says, there is something there.
He's the President of the United States, and we're trying to find the kernel of truth within the madness.
Well, if they literally bulldozed it, rebuilt it and said, but the first people who get priority on the new housing there would be... then we'd all feel very different about it. Palestinians,
yeah. But he's not saying that, and that's the thing which is really, really troubling about this. He's basically saying, you know, all of us, you know, breathed a sigh of relief when that ceasefire came through because of the horrors that the Israeli people have faced and the Palestinian people have faced. We wanted some sort of calm, and basically people thought, hopefully this is the beginning of a political solution, a two-state solution. If the whole thing was to basically say to the Palestinian people, get out, while we come in and rebuild and turn this into some theme park with, like, Trump Towers and a golf course and all of this sort of thing, and you go off to, you know, Egypt and Jordan, by the way, have said they do not want the Palestinians. This is forced displacement of people. Some would describe that as a kind of form of, you know, ethnic cleansing. That is not what anybody envisaged. The Palestinian people deserve the right to have some agency, self-determination, in the same way the Israeli people deserve to have a safe Israel as well.
Guto, here, a very sensitive issue that Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner has decided to tackle, and that is what happens to the Grenfell Tower. I remember we were on air in 2017 when those flames were still burning. I mean, I remember seeing the man waving his white T-shirt out of the window of one of the flats. It was devastating. What happens to the Grenfell Tower? Because presumably it's not safe. It can't stand. Many of the families want it to stand. It's such an important memorial in itself of the tragedy of what happened. And at least you could imagine that until criminal prosecutions are brought, and perhaps until they finish, that the tower should stand. But it looks like Angela Rayner has said, no, it's going to come down. And the trouble is that the families, even though she says she's consulted, don't seem to be on board.
It's really difficult. It's very sensitive. But long-term, it is in no one's interest to have this, tower of rubble, probably hugely unstable, standing in the middle of, where people live, very close to where we are here. You can literally see it from outside this studio. So, it needs to be handled with sensitivity, but it needs to be rebuilt. And I happen to live in New York when they reopened the buildings on the site of the Twin Towers, and that was difficult. But now these are beautiful, tall, functioning buildings, and it's a sign that life moves on. It doesn't mean that people shouldn't remember. It doesn't mean that people are not hurting, but to just leave it there as a scar and actually a waste of space where you could build much-needed homes for people, I don't think that, there's... I think Angela Rayner's essentially right to say we have to do something with that.
Angela Rayner may be right, but it doesn't feel as though it's come out in a particularly sensitive, smart... I mean, it just sort of lands without there being process or explanation. It doesn't seem brilliant handling.
I mean, I don't know the details of how this was handled, but I've got a lot of sympathy for what Guto was saying there. And, of course, I think for so many of the families, it's so... They're probably really conflicted in many ways. I'm sure many of them will absolutely agree with what Guto's just said. But sometimes when you have experienced such loss, the symbol of... You also have an attachment to where your loved ones lived and perished as well.
It's their grave.
Absolutely.
For many, many, many families, for the families of 72 people.
And, when you drove past it, particularly before they put that sort of wrapping around it, this husk of this building, this kind of charred husk of this building was absolutely chilling. But I think the other thing that we must not lose sight of is that many of the survivors and families still feel that they can't move on with their lives in terms of how they've been rehoused and the community. Remember, we've had that inquiry into Grenfell. We're still waiting on some details. But many people feel nobody has really faced justice over that. We've had lots of information about the companies involved in the cladding and the sort of, the shonky building and people ignoring the residents' pleas and almost the prophesying from the residents saying, we are worried that something's going to happen. So I think there's the symbolism of this building, and Ed, you may well be right about the handling, but let's not forget that there's other really big issues, and the big one is who is going to face some justice for this.
Yeah.
Of course, Guto mentions New York, and in New York you also had the terrible tragedy of 9/11, and the people who lost their lives are never forgotten. New York, though, has moved on, and actually, I'm sure many of our viewers have been, the memorial to the 9/11 victims is very powerful, but it's not a graveyard, it's not rubble, it's not, holding on to the past. It is new and different, and it's possible for... this is in a way what I think about the handling, that how the government handles the memorial is integrally tied up to how they handle the dismantling of the building. And to talk about the building going without knowing what happens next is the thing which makes you feel a bit kind of caught.
And the new building could be a tribute to those who died. It could be, the high-quality housing, which, had it been there in the first place, would mean that people had not died. There's all kinds of positive things you can do with that, and you have a memorial garden or wherever they have in New York.
Children's playground.
So it has been handled with a certain lack of sensitivity, but sometimes these things are inevitable because people don't want to hear somebody say...
And just one final point on this, I think the other thing which is so important is all those other buildings around the country that had that same cladding, they want those buildings to be made safe, and all those people trapped in those leasehold, you know, those buildings where they've got the cladding, and they're trapped now. They can't sell their houses. They don't feel their houses are safe. That's another thing the government could get on with doing.
Police and prosecutors said the investigators will need until the end of this year to complete their inquiry into potential prosecutions over cladding insulation.
It's so long.
With final decisions on potential criminal charges by the end of next year. And the families, as you say, Ed, say it is an unbearable wait for justice.
Well, justice delayed is justice denied
Totally.
for so many people.
Talking about the Prime Minister, Guto, and I wonder how you felt about this. Yesterday was Prime Minister's Questions, and I would have imagined the leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch, to pin the Prime Minister down on what was going on Christmas Eve 2020, why Keir Starmer needed a voice coach on Christmas Eve while the rest of the country couldn't celebrate Christmas. But I wonder whether she didn't do that because Keir Starmer would say, I'm not taking lessons from the Conservative Party, who basically had Operation Partygate going on during the lockdown. And now we know the police are going to take no action because basically the 3 years has passed. Is this still an issue for the Prime Minister? Because he was the one who told the Tories it's outrageous what you're doing, partying while everyone else can't even, you know, get on with their normal lives, see their families, go to funerals.
Yeah. I obviously, you know, genuinely believe and say at every opportunity I'd like us to focus in politics on the decisions made by our leaders and judge them on whether they're delivering on the things that they promised and the things that need doing, not on things that are, in that context, from that perspective, ultimately trivial. And yet, this is how I think Keir Starmer won the election. He won by default by pointing out the failures of the Conservatives, not by selling a vision of himself. And that is becoming more and more clear every day. So then, when you do expose things like this, they are relevant in the sense that they expose the con at the heart of the pitch that led to him being in power. Because he himself, why does he need an actress on Christmas Eve to help him attack Boris Johnson over the Brexit deal? This is what's behind this. And this woman travels up from Brighton, as I understand it, to come and see him. Really? Versus Boris Johnson, as we know, destroyed by a piece of cake on his birthday in the cabinet room where he was obliged to be with other people. So nobody wants to go around that track again. But it is an exposure to, you know, when the boot's on the other foot. He hates it.
It doesn't surprise you, though, that, look, this story may not be over, even if the police aren't investigating. Another fact brings it all out into the open again. But for Kemi Badenoch not to raise it at PMQs when her spokesman has been going on about it for days, I mean, if you are right, what's she up to?
I'm always less interested in her and... No, not just...
She is a leader of the opposition.
Yeah, but
I mean,
it's
it
always...
is that thing where, in Parliament, if she chooses not to raise it, that takes...
And over time, she's got to make an impact, and there's a policy announcement today that shows sort of progress on that. But the sort of... How is Kemi playing this is secondary to what it tells us about the man who actually is in control of the country. And I think... A lot of people will think whether he breached COVID rules or not is secondary to how real is this guy who wears glasses given by Lord Ali, who wears suits given by Lord Ali. He needs an actress to tell him how to sort of express himself. Had he been an accountant, maybe without offending accountants, this guy's a barrister. This is what they do for a living. They advocate, they speak, they present themselves. Why does he need an actress to tell him?
He's not the first... Prime Minister, male Prime Minister, to have glamorous women come from around the world to give him advice and support, is he, Guto?
But also, can we just say... He's
on
not...
his voice?
Just saying.
I find that, you know, there's a certain voice that's always been there, and it's never needed training by an actress from Brighton, but...
Well, come on. Margaret Thatcher was famed for having, you know, numerous voice coaches and things like that. Look, what the Conservatives are trying to do
I'm not saying
here...
Boris Johnson was having training on his voice. I don't know what was going on.
Well, we know what was going on. Hang on, and we know what was going on
No, let's get back to Keir Starmer.
No, hang on.
He's a barrister, for God's sakes. He's a barrister. He has presented himself all his life.
You've just had a load of free time on this. I do think I'm allowed to say something on this. The Conservatives, and it's Rick Holden, who is the guy that tried to get Keir Starmer done over Beergate. That came to nothing. This is a last-ditch kind of desperation because the Tories are doing really badly at the moment. Reform is absolutely coming after them. They're trying to sort of like rehash this COVID story, and they're trying to sort of say, oh, he's the same as Boris Johnson. He is completely... Let's not forget that during COVID, Downing Street was the most fined address for COVID offences.
But Ayesha, if this had come out now about Boris Johnson, you would jump on it and say, here's another example
do you know what, Susanna?
of the fact that he breached his own rules.
But I think you're trying to do this a moral equivalence. I understand, but let's just look at the facts. You've got one person, kind of embarrassing doing a voice coach. That's like the funny thing about this.
He is the Prime Minister.
No,
he's not just one person.
No, but Keir Starmer, as leader of the opposition, arguably the most, you know, the second most important job in British politics. We worked with politicians, Ed, who were getting voice training. We worked very closely with people that were getting voice training. I wasn't working in
the pandemic, so therefore...
No. But when we were in politics, working for with the leader of the opposition, we know that, you know, people get training and things like that. That's part of their sort of thing.
I don't think that people are outraged about the fact he has a voice coach. I don't care whether he has a voice coach. But I remember during the Partygate scandal, we were all furious.
We were,
we
Susanna.
had abided by the laws to the letter, and we knew that if we didn't, we would be taken to task.
Let's look at the laws.
Not least
Susanna,
by everybody who was also sticking to the rules.
You were brilliant during the pandemic, right? As was Piers Morgan, who was in the chair with you. Let's look at the actual laws. Adam Wagner, who you've interviewed many times, he did a brilliant thread on this, saying it's not the issue about the voice coach. If you look at the legal instructions on that date...
It had to be reasonably necessary.
Yes, reasonably necessary.
And you weren't allowed to travel between tiers.
For work purposes. Reasonably necessary for work purposes. Okay. His analysis is that this was reasonably necessary for work purposes. And the difference between what he was doing... And you might laugh about the voice coach. I get that. That's a separate... subject, I get that. You could argue she's maybe not done the best job in the world.
Ooh.
But the point is, that he was not having karaoke machines, wine, like suitcases full of booze, karaoke machines, people vomiting up the walls.
Do you know the truth about those people? They're still in number 10. They have not left. The people who were partying the night before the funeral, which is the most offensive one, are still there. They were civil servants.
Oh, Boris Johnson loads of advisors as well. Come on, Guto. The
90% of the people fined are still in number 10. So if you really care that much about them, go and hound them now, because
and remember,
they're still
Boris
there.
Johnson ended up bringing himself down by not having a grip on what was going on at Downing Street and then lying to Parliament.
OK, we talked about suitcases of booze. So, if you go... Do you still go to the pub, you
Yes.
Do you?
Yeah.
Do you,
Less
Ayesha?
than I used to.
OK, yes.
Why? Why?
Because I'm a menopausal
Works
woman
too
now,
hard.
basically. And I work
Are you too tired?
I'm too exhausted. Wine is like emotional Semtex for me these days.
Gen Z are now shunning pork scratchings and alcohol, and a quarter of under 30s would rather have a pint of Coke, and apparently a proportion of them would rather have a charcuterie board than a bag of pork scratchings.
Well, I love a charcuterie board, but back
Can
to
you
where
describe what it is?
Well, it's a bunch of salamis and meats and a little bit of cheese, maybe, and you have it with a bottle of wine.
Would you have cheese on a charcuterie board? Really?
But I'm trying to sort of cut that kind of stuff out. But back to where we started, I think if Gen Z were having a pint and pork scratchings rather than vaping and
doom
hanging
scrolling
out
on their
social
phones.
media,
Totally agree.
they would be well adjusted.
You're right.
Far better adjusted. And throwing a few darts for good measure as well, or playing
The
pool.
idea that Gen Z's gone off the darts, I just don't believe it.
No.
And my Gen Zs play a lot of pool, so I'm not sure about
They
this
all like
either.
to the gym.
Well, that's...
Going to the gym and vaping.
We're not advocating vaping.
But they don't eat pickled eggs.
No pickled eggs, and they certainly don't put their hands in a jar of pickled eggs.
That would be wrong.
And force their friends down to pay for it.
Wrong.
Which was a confession from Ed's childhood.
Life is about learning, about doing wrong things and not doing them again.
Totally right.